The object was described in writing before it disappeared. That is the only reason we know it existed at all. The description runs to 11 lines in the accession ledger of the Harwick Museum of Natural History in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a mid-sized institution that operated from 1881 until its absorption into the city's municipal collections in 1931. The ledger itself survives. It is held today in the Philadelphia City Archives under collection reference PCA 1931/HM/003, and the entry for the object appears on page 214, dated September 6, 1894, in the handwriting of the museum's then chief cataloger, a man named Frederick Albrecht. Albrecht was not a careless man. His other entries from that same period are precise, methodical, consistent, dimensions in inches, weight estimates in pounds and ounces, material descriptions cross-referenced against the museum's existing classification system. He had been cataloging acquisitions for the Harwick since 1886. He knew what he was looking at when objects came through the intake room. What he wrote about this object on September 6, 1894, did not match anything else in the ledger. Not in tone, not in the careful way he seemed to reach for words that weren't quite right and then reach again. Not in the fact that he left 3 of his standard classification fields blank, fields he had never left blank in 8 years of entries, and wrote instead in the margin beside them a single phrase in German, Ich bin nicht sicher, I am not certain. The object was given accession number HM-1894-2217. It was assigned to Vault Room C on the museum's lower level, and sometime between September of 1894 and the museum's first full inventory audit in March of 1897, it vanished. No transfer record, no loan agreement, no disposal notice, no theft report. Accession number HM-1894/2217 simply stops appearing in any document after the initial ledger entry, as if the object catalogued itself and then quietly ceased to exist. Frederick Albrecht's 11-line description is the only physical account of the object that has ever been found. It reads, in translation from his mixture of English and German notation, as follows. Stone composition, surface texture inconsistent with known sedimentary or igneous classification. Color, deep gray with intermittent banding of a lighter material, possibly quartz intrusion, though banding geometry is regular beyond natural expectation. Dimensions, 14 inches in length, 6 inches at widest cross-section, 4 inches in depth. Weight, 9 pounds 4 ounces. Surface bears marking or incision along 2 faces, not decorative in any familiar cultural tradition represented in current collection. Incision depth uniform. Tool marks absent. Origin of acquisition. Donated, private collector, name withheld at donor's request. Provenance documentation, none provided. That last line is the one that should have stopped everything. Provenance documentation, none provided. In 1894, a museum of the Harwick standing did not accept objects without provenance. That was not a modern standard. It was already institutional practice by the 1880s, driven by the collecting wars of the post-Civil War period that had flooded American museums with fraudulent and looted material. Frederick Albrecht knew this. The museum's director at the time, a Dr. Cornelius Hartley, knew this. Someone accepted HM 1894-2217 anyway. Someone made an exception. And whoever donated it was so insistent on anonymity that their name does not appear anywhere in the Harwick's surviving donor correspondence files. Not in 1894, not in 1895, not in any subsequent year. An object with no origin, accepted by a museum that required origins, catalogued by a man who admitted he didn't know what he was looking at, and gone within 3 years. The Harwick's 1897 inventory audit is also in the Philadelphia City Archives. It is a complete document, 847 items listed, cross-referenced against the accession ledgers going back to 1881. The auditor was a contracted accountant named James Pell, brought in from outside the museum specifically to produce an independent record.
Pell's audit lists 846 items confirmed present. One item, HM-1894-2217, is marked in his column with a notation that reads, "Not located, ledger entry verified, physical object absent from assigned vault position and all adjacent storage." Below that notation, in different handwriting, identified by archivists as belonging to Dr. Cornelius Hartley, are 4 words written in the margin: "Matter referred upward, CH." Referred upward, to whom and for what purpose, is not recorded anywhere in the Harwick's surviving administrative files. There is no follow-up correspondence from Hartley on the matter. There is no board resolution. There is no insurance claim, which would have been standard procedure for a missing acquisition. The matter was referred upward, and then the paper trail ends. Dr. Hartley retired from the Harwick directorship in 1899, 5 years before his previously announced retirement date. His personal papers were donated to Haverford College upon his death in 1914. A researcher named Carol Sims examined those papers in 1998 while writing a history of Philadelphia's institutional museum culture. She noted in a footnote, footnote 31 of her unpublished manuscript, a copy of which is held at the Free Library of Philadelphia, that Hartley's files for the years 1894 through 1899 were unusually sparse compared to adjacent years, with no correspondence at all surviving in the same 4-month window when HM-1894-2217 arrived, was catalogued, and began its disappearance from the institutional record. Here is what the standard explanation looks like and why it doesn't hold. Museums lose objects. It happens more than the public knows. Misfilings, mislabelings, objects moved during renovations and never returned to their logged positions, theft by staff or visitors, deterioration so severe the object is disposed of without proper documentation. The Harwick was not a large institution. Its Vault Room C, based on the 1897 audit dimensions recorded by James Pell, held approximately 200 objects in a space of roughly 400 square feet. Losing something there is not impossible.
But losing something and then generating no insurance claim, no internal investigation, no board discussion, and no correspondence from the director during the 4-month period surrounding its disappearance, that is not institutional carelessness. That is institutional silence. Those are different things. Carelessness leaves a paper trail of confusion. Silence leaves nothing. And nothing is exactly what the Harwick left behind regarding HM-1894-2217. There is one more detail in Frederick Albrecht's ledger entry that has not been mentioned yet because it appears not in the main description field but in the small supplemental notes column on the far right margin of the page, a column Albrecht used rarely and only for observations he considered outside his standard classification language. His supplemental note for HM-1894-2217 reads, "Weight distribution does not correspond to dimensions. Object feels heavier at center than mass calculation would suggest. Interior composition unknown." He weighed it, he measured it, he calculated what it should weigh based on its dimensions and the apparent density of its surface material, and then he wrote that it felt wrong, that something inside it did not match what was outside. Frederick Albrecht catalogued thousands of objects in his career at the Harwick. He left that note once. In 1911, 17 years after the object's accession and 14 years after its disappearance from the audit, a letter arrived at the Harwick from a man named Professor Daniel Weyrich of the archaeology faculty at Johns Hopkins University. That letter is in the Philadelphia City Archives within the Harwick collection, filed under Incoming Correspondence for 1911. Weyrich's letter asked in formal academic language whether the Harwick retained in its collection an object acquired in the autumn of 1894, a stone artifact of unusual surface composition, approximately 14 inches in length, bearing non-cultural incised markings. He described it in enough detail that it could only be HM-1894-2217. He did not explain how he knew about it. He asked whether he might arrange a visit to examine it.
The Harwick's response, signed by its then director, Elias Morrow, is also in the file. It is one sentence. The Harwick Museum has no record of the object you have described. No record. Not missing, not transferred, not destroyed. No record. The accession ledger containing Frederick Albrecht's 11-line entry was sitting in the Harwick's administrative office when Elias Morrow wrote that response. Page 214, accession number HM-1894-2217. It had not been removed. It had not been altered. Morrow either did not check it or chose to say something he knew was not true. Professor Weyrich sent one follow-up letter 3 weeks later, asking for clarification. He received no reply. His name does not appear in any further Harwick correspondence. His faculty records at Johns Hopkins, accessible through the university's archives, show that he resigned his position in the spring of 1912 without completing the book on pre-Columbian material culture he had been working on for 6 years. His colleagues at the time described his departure as sudden. One of them, in a letter preserved in the Johns Hopkins Eisenhower Library under MS 1912-WYR, wrote that Weyrich had told him shortly before leaving that he had found what he was looking for and that it would have been better if he hadn't. The object described by Frederick Albrecht, the banding geometry regular beyond natural expectation, the incisions with no tool marks, the weight that didn't match the mass, appears in no natural history classification published before 1894 or after it. That is a testable claim. The major classification literature of the period, Dana's System of Mineralogy, the Smithsonian's Annual Report of the Board of Regents, the published Proceedings of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, contains no reference to a stone material matching Albrecht's description. Which means that either Albrecht was wrong about what he observed, which his own hedging language suggests he knew was possible, or he was right, and what he was looking at was something that fell outside every existing category his training had given him.
A man trained to classify objects across 8 years at a natural history museum who left blank the classification fields he had never left blank before and wrote in the margin that he was not certain. There is a particular kind of institutional document that gets written when something arrives that an institution doesn't know how to process. It looks exactly like Albrecht's entry. Careful, precise in the measurable details, silent in the interpretive fields, and followed almost always by administrative silence from the levels above. In 2019, a Philadelphia-based archival researcher named Donna Fitch was working through the Harwick collection for an unrelated project, a survey of 19th-century natural history acquisition practices, when she encountered the 1894 ledger entry. She published a short notice about it in the Pennsylvania Heritage Quarterly, Volume 41, Issue 3, describing it as an example of incomplete provenance documentation and raising the question of what had become of the object. The notice generated 2 responses. The first was from a museum studies professor who suggested the object had likely been deassectioned during the Harwick's 1931 absorption into the city collections and that its records had been lost in the process.
That is a reasonable explanation. The city absorption of 1931 was administratively chaotic, and documentation losses from that period are well established. The second response came from a retired archivist in Baltimore named George Tsui, who had spent 23 years working in the Smithsonian Institution's Storage and Registration Division. Tsui told Donna Fitch in a phone call she documented in her research notes that during a routine audit of the Smithsonian's Natural History Museum's unrestricted storage in 2003, he had encountered a receiving log entry from 1895, 1 year after HM-1894-2217's accession at the Harwick, referencing an inbound transfer from a private intermediary in Philadelphia. The transfer log listed no sending institution. It listed one item, a stone object, 14 inches, gray banding, weight approximately 9 pounds.
The Smithsonian's receiving log entry for that transfer assigned the object an internal reference number, SI 1895 UTR 0044. UTR, in the Smithsonian's internal shorthand for that period, stood for Under Technical Review. George Tsui told Donna Fitch that SI 1895 UTR 0044 did not appear in any subsequent Smithsonian inventory he had access to. He told her he had flagged it in 2003 as an unresolved transfer. He told her the flag was acknowledged and then closed without explanation by his supervisor at the time. He retired the following year. There is an object that was described in writing in Philadelphia in 1894 by a man who did not know what it was. It moved, or was moved, to Washington by 1895. It entered a federal institution under a designation that meant someone there also did not know what it was or was not ready to say. And then it stopped generating any document at all. Two institutions, two gaps in the record. A Johns Hopkins professor who found what he was looking for and wished he hadn't. A Smithsonian archivist whose flagged entry was closed without explanation. A museum director who wrote one sentence denying the object existed and never wrote about it again.
The incisions on the two faces of that object, the ones Frederick Albrecht noted were uniform in depth and bore no tool marks, have never been described by anyone with the training to analyze them, because no analyst has ever been given access to an object that, on paper, does not exist. What Albrecht saw in that intake room on September 6, 1894, was real enough that it moved 3 institutions to silence and 1 professor to ruin. Whatever is incised on its surface has been sitting in a vault somewhere in this country for over 130 years, sitting in the dark, unread, deliberately unread. The stone does not care how long it waits. It was made to last longer than the institutions trying to keep it quiet. And the name of the private collector who donated it, the name that was withheld at the donor's request and never recorded anywhere, appears in a single uncatalogued letter found in a different archive entirely in connection with 2 other objects that were also donated to American institutions in 1894, objects that are also missing. That letter is where we go next.